Up to the chapter number 6. Chapter number 6, and so we'll just go back and finish the chapter number 3 because this was pending. So I was skipping this chapter because technical stuffs over here. Just it's a product based stuffs like any typical product of this product. Okay, you will see this. The role-based control, role-based access control, how to control the product, how to control the user access. So how to provide user access for particular users, how to create users. So these are the things which we are going to see. And we'll start with the third chapter. First one is authentication, so configuring the identity provider. Second is like authorization. So hope you have completed the survey also. If not, you can complete the survey as you are listening to the session now. The surveys were able to take up the survey. Here in the chapter number 3, so we are going to see something called role-based access control. So shortly we call that as RBAC. Any typical enterprise product, this one, role-based access control. And to do the role-based access control, we have two means. Like first, we have to create something called, so first layer is called the authentication layer. So this is a starting point, the authentication layer. In the authentication layer, we are going to deal with how to create users. In the authentication layer, basically we are going to create users. And in Openshift, Openshift doesn't have an independent mechanism to create users. So it allows us to configure our own authentication means. Actually, it supports 8 different authentication mechanisms. You can configure one or more authentication, or you can just go with one authentication mechanism. So you have to configure any one of the authentication mechanism, like you have to configure any one of the identity provider. After configuring the identity provider, through that you will create users, and through that users you will be accessing the cluster. So that will be the first layer, authentication layer. And the second layer is authorization layer. In the authorization layer, we are going to provide, so whatever the users we have created out of authentication layer, for that users we are going to provide a role. So based on the role, the user will be acting upon. So all users are not same. So some user may be superior to other, or some user may be inferior to. So depending on the particular user's role or user's capability, we are going to give them the role. So that's what we are going to see in the second layer, which is authentication layer. So this will cover in the second section. First section will cover about the authentication, and we'll learn about different identity providers. So here we are going to configure only one identity provider as a part of our curriculum. Even though this will be a simple one at this foundation level. The next level, like the next level of the course, will configure the other identity providers. So here, this is simple identity provider we are going to configure here. So because the mechanism is very simple when compared to the other identity provider, the mechanism is a little bit complicated when compared to this. Okay. So before we go and do that, before configuring the identity provider, we need to understand some terminologies here. So this first section is configuring an identity provider. So here we will be describing about Openshift users and groups. So that means we are going to understand terminology.
Bro, your line is making.
Okay. Let me now log in, log out, and log back.
Okay.
Okay, I hope now it will be clear.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, we'll see about some terms here. First term is user. So user is an entity which interacts with the API server, and we do have different types of users. Even at the server level, we have different types of users. We have a root user, we have regular user. Just similar to that, in the Openshift platform level, we have different types of users. Later on, we'll see about that. Now the user generally means an entity which interacts with the API server. So that's what the user is. And the next is identity. So identity is a means to differentiate the user. So differentiate the identity mechanism. As I told, the Openshift supports 8 different types of identity provider. So when you have configured a multiple identity provider, so say for example, I have Ldap as well as I have Keystone. So when I have these two, so how to differentiate the users coming out of these 2 different identity providers? Maybe the user may be the same name. So how to differentiate it? So for that we have something called an identity. So identity is a combination of identity provider, then the username, plus there will be a UUID, the universally unique UID. The user ID will be generated. So this will not be same for 2 different users. So this will be never same for the 2 different users. Through that I can uniquely identify that. So that is what is an identity is. So identity is just to it keeps a record of successful authentication coming out of a different identity provider. So that's what an identity. Later on, when we are configuring it, I'll show you that identity. And next is service account. We already learned about the service account. So we have used as a use case in the chapter number 4, where we are using the service account for an authentication, or you can say the privilege granting or privilege escalation. So instead of exposing the user integrity or exposing the user credentials to the application to prevent the user integrity, so we go for service account. Service account is it acts in a place of a user, but it's not like a user, but it acts in the place of a user. It's almost like a user account where we would do with privilege escalation using the service account. So we already used a use case in chapter number 4 when we are configuring the SEC. There we use the service account to do privilege escalation, where we want to run the root based containers. And the second other thing is a role. So role is like nothing but a set of permission. So a set of permission where you assign it for a particular user. So the role has different, each role will have a set of permissions. So I cannot give an individual permission to the user. So I have to assign a set of permissions so that the user will be able to exercise his authority. So role can be assigned to a group or it can be assigned to a user. So this is what a role. So you grant permission to the user or group or service account by assigning role to them. So this is what the role is. And the last one is group. So the purpose of group in the Openshift container platform is to do a role inheritance. So for example, I may have 100 users. Okay. So for this 100 users, I want to assign same role. So I want to give just a uniform role to all. So in that case, instead of going and individually assigning the roles, so all the time to the 100 users for 100 times, I have to repeat the same task. So for that, what I can do is I can group this 100 users together. I can create a group. I can put these users inside that group. I can use a script file or I can use Ansible to do that job. So to create a group and add these users to the group. And after that, what you can do is you can assign a role to that group. So once you assign the role to the group, automatically the group members, if it is 100 or 10, whatever the members are there inside that group, they will inherit that role. So that means they will have the role. And in case if I want to remove this, so I can remove the role, just remove the role from the group. Automatically the group will not be removed, group will be there, members will be there, only the role is removed, and ultimately the users who are using that role previously, so once you remove that role, they will not able to use that role anymore. So the role, they will be devoid of using that role. So it's the purpose of having a group. So group just helps in role inheritance. Okay. So these are the some of the terms. So which is you might already know these terms, but now we have to know these terms with respect to the Openshift content platform. So what that means. You already know what is a user. So with respect to the Openshift content platform, the user is someone who is interacting with the API server. Okay. This may be a kubeadmin user, or maybe a regular user which we are going to create. So that is a user. So next thing, we'll go for the identity provider. So the Openshift supports 8 different identity providers. So Openshift itself doesn't have an inbuilt authentication mechanism, except the kubeadmin mechanism which we were using so far. We were logging in as a kubeadmin user and we were doing all these things. So that is like a kubeadmin user is almost like a root user for a server. So it's almost similar to that. So we are doing that. So except that authentication, that mechanism. So Openshift doesn't have any individual or independent identity provider mechanism. The reason for that, you can able to integrate whatever the identity provider mechanism which is already there in your present environment. So, but that should be limited to this 8 identity providers we are going to discuss. And if it's not among the 8, then you have no choice. You have to configure that identity provider. So Openshift supports the HTTPS identity provider. This is provided by the Apache. So this is a web authentication mechanism. So it is going to authenticate the web users. For that, it is used the HTTPS identity provider mechanism. So this is supported in Openshift. Then Keystone Authentication. So this is another authentication mechanism. If you are using OpenStack, there you can find the Keystone Authentication. So use extensively. So that same Keystone Authentication you can configure it for the Openshift also. Then it supports the Ldap, which is mostly used in a lot of infrastructure platforms. So the Ldap authentication mechanism, Ldap lightweight directory access control protocol. So this mechanism is supported in a lot of Linux and Windows environment. So you can use this Ldap authentication mechanism also. So you can configure this, and Openshift supports this one. And so the developers can use their own GitHub, and they can GitHub account, and using that they can log in into the identity providers, or that they can log in into the Openshift. And it supports OpenID Connect. This is one of the identity provider mechanism. OpenID Connect this is actually a protocol. So using that also you can, that is also supported in the Openshift. The Google authentication mechanism. So the mobile platform development, or mobile developers, they may be extensively using the Google account for mobile application development. So if they want to containerize and manage application platform on the Openshift, they can still use their own Google account authentication to authenticate into the Openshift. And also finally we have Red Hat IDM and Red Hat SSO. So these are one Red Hat product, Red Hat Identity Management System and Red Hat Single Sign-On System. So that is also supported here. So you can use this too. For using this, but initially you will not have anything configured in the Openshift. So Openshift, when you install the Openshift, you will not have anything configured over there. So you have to configure this. So you have to say which identity provider you are going to use. So you have to configure that. You have to provision that information to the Openshift cluster. After provisioning that information, you have to go and configure that identity provider mechanism. You have, for example, if you are using Ldap, you have to configure the Ldap mechanism. So you have to generate the certificates, you have to generate the users, you have to generate the required domains and all these things which is required for configuring the Ldap. So you have to go and configure this Ldap. So once you have configured that, you have to provide that information to the Openshift platform through the configuration files. There are some configuration files. You will modify that file and you will provide that information. Once you provide that information, through that you will be able to authenticate into the cluster through that mechanism. So whatever the users later on you will create on the Ldap, the same Ldap users can get into the Openshift cluster. That is one point. Like we are doing just authentication, and the next thing you has to continue. So just by simply authenticating into the Openshift, you will not able to do anything. You have to assign the role. That we'll see in the next part. So based on the role, you can be able to act. If he is not having any role in the Openshift platform, then the user will be dummy. So you can log in, but you cannot do anything. You have to simply log in and you have to stay there. So you will not have any project access. You will not able to see the cluster level information. Nothing you can do. if he is not having any role in the OpenShift cluster. So the first level is to authenticate him. So he has to get into the OpenShift. This is what we are seeing here. The next level will be to give him a role, give him authority. So that based on that he is able to act within that role. That will be seen in the next section. So how to do that, how to assign the role and all these things. And so I was telling about the identity. So identity is something which is the combination of identity provider, the username, and UUID. The UUID stands for universally unique user ID, which will be unique across the cluster. So this is what an identity. Just it's there to differentiate the differentiate a user from different identity providers in case if you are using multiple identity providers. And next is we'll see how to configure the identity provider. So we need to understand the flow mechanism. So we were discussing about the different terminologies. We understood this different terminologies. Then we will now see. So we have already seen about the identity providers. I have covered this section. Now we have to see how to authenticate the API request. So we are basically going to see how to configure this identity provider. Here in our case, we are going to configure this identity provider. Even though a lot of identity providers are supported, like eight different identity providers are supported, so we are going to configure this identity provider. Through that, we are going to create a user, and for that user, we are going to assign the role. So this is what we are going to limit the discussion, because in our curriculum we are covering this HTTPS identity provider. So how to configure this and all, how to configure this and create the users out of this, and created users we are going to assign the role in the next section. And if you want to configure other identity providers, so for example, you want to configure the Google Authentication. So I will give you a reference. I will direct you to the documentation where you can find about how to configure the other identity. If you know the steps, so whatever the steps which we are discussing, if you know the steps, if you know the how to in a hierarchical fashion, how to change these things. If you know that information, you can configure other things. Only things you have to need a particular information pertaining to the particular mechanism. So for example, if you are using the Google Authentication, so you need to information about the Google Authentication things. Or if you're using Ldap, you need to know about the certificate locations, you need to know about the domain names and all these things, which is respect to the Ldap mechanism. So like that, you will be configuring that information into the OpenShift. Then using that, you can be able to authenticate into the OpenShift. So here we are going to restrict to something called HTTPS identity provider authentication. So far we were using, we were logging in using the kubeadmin. The kubeadmin authenticating as a cluster administrator. We were using the kubeadmin and logging in into the OpenShift cluster. And there is another method also. You can use some X509 client certificate. So this certificate will be available when you do the installation. So this certificate will be available in the installation system. And using this certificate also you can authenticate, but we are not use this method often, because this is a very vulnerable method. Because if you place the certificate in that system, so no longer you need to provide any authentication, so you can directly access that. So this method will not be most preferable. So this but this is also one of the method. You will export this, you will get that file, this kubeconfig file, you will export to your local system, then you can execute any command. So no need to log in. So just embed that certificate into that. This certificate will be available when you're doing the installation. So like this, you will get a info message, or you can say debug message. So the debug message, you'll find where that path is, where is the location of the kubeconfig file. Using that also you can authenticate, but we are not seeing that. But this is one of the options. One option without the identity provider. One option, you can go through as a kubeadmin. That is one option. If the kubeadmin is not there, the other option is you can use this client certificate. The client certificate, using that you can authenticate also. But this will not be a much preferred method in the production, because the production side, so they will not give you a kubeadmin authority, and they are not also going to give the handing over the certificate to any normal user. So this is not most preferred method. But anyhow, so these are the other methods. If I don't have identity provider, using these two methods, I can authenticate into the cluster. So now we'll see how to configure this HTTPS identity provider. So for that, I need to understand a flow mechanism. So configuring the identity providers, a flow mechanism. Here, what is actually happening when you are authenticating? We have the OpenShift cluster, so we have the workstation. From the workstation, I am typing in the username and password. So my request goes to the OpenShift cluster. Then, what is the flow mechanism? What is a mechanism or authentication mechanism happening inside the OpenShift cluster? So when I type in the username and password from my client machine, then to the point where the user is authenticated, then the user getting into the OpenShift cluster, what all things are happening. So we already did using the cube admin. Now you need to understand this flow mechanism with respect to the identity provider. Then we'll go and configure that identity provider. Okay. So the first thing, so during the first day, so we have discussed about the architecture of OpenShift. So I hope that time you remember the architecture where we have one component called OpenShift OAuth. So this is a pod. So when a user wanted to access this, he has to reach this or he has to get to this pod. So this is the pod which the user will be accessing. So as a user, I will be accessing this pod. So as a user, I'll be accessing this pod, and this will get my request to the API server. The API server, if it is authenticating my request, then I'm able to access the cluster. So this is the mechanism. So this is what happens. So when you're typing in the username and password, so your request actually goes to the pod, the OAuth pod. This OAuth pod will be running inside the project called Openshift-Authentication. So this is a default project. So inside this project, this pod will be running. So we can verify that. So OC get pods. I can go wide. So OC get pods. I just mention the project name Openshift-Authentication. So if you look at there, so you can see this OAuth OpenShift pod is running. So for high availability, they scale it twice. So this is running inside this. This is the first authentication element. So your request actually reaches this pod. So this pod, once the request reaches this pod, then this will check the general cluster resource. The general cluster, one of the general cluster resources is called OAuth cluster. So this will check this cluster resource. So since it's a cluster resource, I'm just representing in the cluster. So this is a project resource. You have to look for this resource inside the project, this particular object or resource. You have to look for this. This is a cluster resource. You have to look into the cluster resource. So generally, there are a lot of resources on the cluster. So you can check the resources of the cluster by this command. You can use OC API resources. So using this command, if you just type in OC API resources and give enter, you will see all the cluster resources, or you can say API resources. Here I need to configure this one, so which is OAuth. So if I just grep for this, here you can find the OAuth. So I need to configure this cluster resource, OAuth cluster resource, the config.openshift.io. So this is the OAuth cluster resource. This is what I need to configure. So here initially this resource will be empty. So if you list this resource, if you do OC get resource, you can call OAuth cluster resource, OAuth cluster, and if you use YAML format to see that, you list it, you can see it is configured. Actually, just 1 minute, because I did run some lab setup command. It was so initially this will be empty. So like this, since I've run some lab setup commands that has configured this, initially it will be empty. So this OAuth cluster, if you look at the resource, you can see the kind. So leave about this metadata. Metadata is just information about that. You'll see some timestamp information. You'll see some dummy variables like that. So you can leave about this metadata. So you can look at the spec. So the spec is can say this initially it will be empty. So what we have to do is we have to configure this. So what we have to configure here is the place where we are going to tell my information about my identity provider. So here I have to tell my identity provider details, like I have to provide, say, what type of identity provider I'm using and what is the name of the identity provider, these things. And I will be configuring the information about the user credentials, like the user details, the usernames and passwords. So I'm not going to store that information inside this, because here I'm typing in the username and password. So this username and password need to be checked. So where I have to store this username and password, I'm going to store this in another project called Openshift-config project. So we already used this project in chapter 6 when we are doing that bootstrapping template modification. We use the same project. So I'm going to configure, I'm going to create, so the user credential file, I'm going to bring that file into this project as a secret. So here you will find the secret. In the secret you will find the username and password. So whatever the username password they have typed here, so if it is present in this file, so then the auth pod will authenticate that user. If it is not present, so the auth pod will not allow that user to get into the Openshift. So this is the overall flow mechanism. So your request goes to this, and this resource will check the general auth cluster resource. So here you are going to say what is your identity provider. So it is HTPass, or it is Ldap, or it is Keystone, or it is Google. So whatever the identity provider is there, you will configure this here. So this will be our part. So we have to, as administrator, we have to configure this one, and also we have to place the credential information, like the usernames and password, credential file information. I have to place that information inside this project. So Openshift-config project, I have to place that information over here. So now you can see two projects are involved. One project is Openshift Authentication project. So here we are not doing any configuration. So here we are going to just verify whether the pod is running, or when you make any configuration and the pod is redeploying. So you are going to verify this pod. And here we are going to configure the resource. We are going to configure as per whatever identity provider you configure. Here in our curriculum, we are covering the HTPass identity provider. So here we are going to see how to configure that HTPass identity provider. And in this section, here we are going to place our credential information, the file, the user credential information file. So this will be our flow mechanism. Take a screenshot of this for reference. So there is nothing technical over here, like, so why I have to place this secret here, why I have to configure. This is like a logical flow they have created. So we have to go with the flow mechanism. So we have to understand this flow mechanism. After understanding the basic flow mechanism, we are going to configure that. So that's all we are going to do. So nothing to think in a technical way. So we are just understanding this flow mechanism, and we are going to configure the things according to this requirement. Okay. So now we'll go and configure this. Now we are going to configure in a stepwise manner. So steps for configuring the HTPass identity provider. So remember this steps will be almost same for configuring any identity provider. Only thing, it is going to differ on the particular authentication mechanisms. So if I'm using the Ldap, the way you configure the user in the Ldap is different. And if you are using the Keystone, way you are going to create a user in the Keystone will be different from way you are creating in the Ldap. So this mechanism differs. But once you have configured that, the placing the information inside the cluster, configuring the configuring the auth cluster, that almost remains same, and the informations will vary depending on what information, what input you have to provide. So that will vary depending on the identity provider you're using. So for that we can refer to the documentation. So once you know one identity provider mechanism thoroughly, so you can configure the other identity providers, provided you know that mechanism. So if you are doing the Ldap, so you should know how the Ldap works. So how to configure the Ldap users. Then only you can configure that, as well as configure that same identity provider mechanism into the Openshift environment. So if you don't know how the Ldap is working, so without knowing the mechanism of that, it's difficult to configure that inside, because I need to have some information from the Ldap. That information I'm going to configure as input provision detail to that particular auth cluster file. So I need to provide this information. If I don't know how the Ldap is working, so I cannot provide this information about it. So manually I can know that steps I can do it, but if I know how it is working, it will be easy to do. Sometimes the troubleshooting or easy to see how it is, where to go and modify all the stuffs. So I need to know where my Ldap server is located. So how to look into the Ldap server, the expiry dates, how to generate the certificates for the Ldap. So all these things I need to know. Know that mechanism with respect to that particular identity provider. Okay, so here we are going to configure the HTPass identity provider. HTPass is a very simple identity provider, so we don't have that much work to do on this side with respect to the identity provider. When you compare it to the Ldap or Keystone, we have some work to do on the on that side. Like if you are configuring the Keystone, you have to generate the Keystone server, you have to generate a certificate for the Keystone, you have to generate the users, you have to generate the secret files. There are a lot of things are there with respect to the Keystone authentication mechanism. So that much work is not there in the HTTPS. It's very simple to use. So for us to understand the foundation, how to configure an identity provider, so we are going to in our curriculum we are covering this HTTPS. It's very simple to use and easy to configure. So we'll see how to use that. So first step, I need to create HTTPS user credential file. So the file which we are going to place inside this config project, I have to create that file locally in my system. So later on I'm going to place that file over here. So I have to configure whatever this flow mechanism is required. I have to configure that things. So I may configure in some different ways. So I may configure this first, then come here and configure this. So that doesn't matter. So sometimes I will just configure here. So here I'm not going to modify anything. I'll leave this as leave that as it is. So that doesn't matter. So first I need to, but I have to see the informations which is required are placed in the particular points or particular projects. Here I need to have this credential information over here in this project. I need to configure this auth cluster, so this should be in place. If it is not there, so we cannot able to. So there will be a flow in the break. There will be a break in the flow mechanism, so I cannot able to authenticate to the cluster. Okay. So first thing, I need to create a HTTPS user credential file in the local system using HTTPS WD tool. That is what I'm going to do. So here, whatever I'm doing, so I'm not doing anything with respect to the Openshift. I'm going to do now in the local system. So here I'm going to use a tool called HTTPS WD. So this is a tool. Using this tool, I'm going to create that credential file, and I'm going to use this specific options. So C option for creating a new file, and small b option. This is for mentioning the password in the command line itself rather than prompting for it. So in the real time, you will not use this option. In the production time, your production environment, you will not go for this option, because in the production environment you are not supposed to type any password in the plain text format, so you will not use this option, but here we will use it for reference. And I need to mention this is optional, but I go for this as a practice. I need to mention the -B option. So this is for encryption method. So this is a strong, very secure encryption method which I'm going to. If you don't mention this option, it will take the MD5 encryption, which is a default encryption. That is going to encrypt the password which you are going to give for that user. Okay. So this tool is coming from a package called httpd-tools. So you have to install this tool on the system where you want to have that HTTPS WD tool. So you have to install this package actually, httpd-tools. So this package you have to install on the system where you want to use it. So this tool is already installed in this package is already installed in my system. So if you want to use this tool, this command line tool for creating the user credential files, so you have to have that tool through that particular package. Okay. So here I'm going to create a directory, the directory called mypass. I'm creating this directory. So inside this directory, so I'm going to create the file. So now I'm going to use the HTTPS WD tool. So here I'm going to use small c option. This is for create. So later on, if you have doubt what this option means, just type that tool and see the usage. There you can see this options, what each option means. So here I'm using the C option to create the file. I'm using the small b option to type the password in the command line itself. And I'm going to use the capital B option to say my encryption method. I'm using here bcrypt encryption method. And here I'm going to say the directory which I've created. So I'm going to create the file inside the directory. So here I'm going to say the file name. So file name I'm calling it users. Any name you can call this file. So I'm going to call this as users. Then I'm going to say the username. So I'm going to say create a user called, for example, I'm going to create a user called Raj with a password Ldap. So there's a password I'm assigning for that user. So whatever I'm giving a space, whatever I'm giving after that, this is the password. So I'm creating that user. Now you can look at this now. Now you can see the directory, my pass. There you can find this user file created. If you view this file, you can see that user is created and his password is encrypted. So this is how this password is encrypted. So this file now has the user credential information. Now I can add another user to this file. So all this I created for the first time. If I want to add the second user to the file, I can do that. The same command. So here I no need to mention the small c option, because now already the file is existing. So no need to mention the small c option. Other option as it is. So small b and capital B option as it is. So here I'm going to say the user name. The second user I'm going to add is I'm going to say Sam. I'm going to say give him the password Ldap123. So I'm adding the second user. Now if you look at this, now you can see two users are there inside this file. So user details. So this is the username and this is the user credential. This is user password, which is encrypted. Okay. So now I created this credential file. So this is, I did everything now purely on my local system. So nothing I've done on the Openshift. So I have to go to the second step. I have to import this user file which I have just now created. I have to import this file into the Openshift. So since this is a sensitive information or the credential information, I have to import that as a secret. And where we have to import it? We have to import it on the Openshift-config project. Why? The reason is this is a flow mechanism. So because the information should be available on this project as a secret entity, so the file should be created here. So this should be available over here. Okay. So there's a reason why we are understanding the flow mechanism. Then we are going and configuring. There's a reason why we have to create it. And now we will learn some concepts which we left over in chapter 4. Like as I told, we'll see with a use case. So in the chapter 4, when we are learning about the secret, I told that the secrets can be created in two different formats. One is the generic type secret, where you can create that as literal values. Another one is you can create the secret as from the file. So here in this chapter, we are going to see how to create the secret from the file. You are going to see this, and also you are going to see the concept of user secret modification. So how to modify the secret, how to update the secret. So how you will extract the secret and how you will modify the secret. So we are going to see this with the use case. So already we have seen one use case for the TLS secret in chapter 5 with respect to the secret. Now we are going to see the use case of how to modify the secret, because here when you want to do the user modification, we have to follow that step. And also you're going to see how to create a file as a secret. Okay. So here the second step, I'm going to do that. So we will go to the here. So here already have everything in place in my local system. I'm going to import this into the Openshift. So make sure you are logged into the Openshift. OC who am I? You should have a cluster permission to do that. So you should have complete cluster permission. That you should be initially you should be a ClickCube admin to do this job. So I'm going to create that secret. OC create secret. Secret type will be generic. Now I'm going to create it from file. So whenever I'm creating from a file, so the file path I have to store as a variable. They have to store as a variable called htpasswd. So this is a consistent variable which you have to use. So you have to use the exactly as htpasswd. But in some cases, which is not the case of configuring the users, you can use different variables name. So, but here this variable will be referenced in another different place, which will be looking for the same exact keyword. So we have to use that as a use that keyword as a variable here, htpassw. So we should not change this. So here I'm going to say my file path, which is inside my pass directory. So the name of the file is users. Then I'm going to create that inside this project. I'm going to mention that project name. So either you can switch to that project or you can create in this manner. I just will create anyhow in the that particular project. The reason for creating is the flow mechanism. So the flow mechanism requires that you create this secret inside this project, because this is going to reference this inside this project. If you create in that elsewhere, so it will never able to reference that. So I'm going to create this secret. Oh, I forgot to give the name for the secret. So here I have to give the name. So I'm going to say the name of the secret as my secret. So this is the name of the secret. Now I'm creating it. So now the secret is created. Now I can list the secret. OC get secret -o YAML. So let's say the secret name is my secret. So -o YAML. So I will list the secret from here. If you list it, you can see now the secret is stored as a reference variable, which is htpasswd. So you cannot see what is the value or what is the content, but just to verify it. So just verify the name which I've given, verify the project which it is created, the namespace. Just verify these things using this command. So now we are done with the second step, so which is modifying this. Second step is importing that file. User file is a secret in this project. Now we go to the third step. So third step, what we have to do is we have to configure the OAuth cluster to use the htpass identity provider. So now we come back to this as per flow mechanism. Now we have done with this. Now we have to do this. The OAuth cluster we have to modify. So modification you can do in multiple ways. One is you can directly edit that file. So whatever your content is there, just directly edit that content. Initially it will be empty. To edit that content, save that file, it will automatically take that resource. Or in the book, what they did is they have created the files separately and they are replacing that information. So they will use the OC replace command to replace that information. Any method you can follow. So whatever is comfortable for you. Here I am going to edit that file. So here I'm going to do, this is the file which we want to. So this is initially empty. I want to manipulate this file. So here I'm going to provide these details. So what I can do is OC edit OAuth cluster. I will edit this file. So here I go to the specs section. So here I will remove this content. So here I'm going to save the identity provider information. So when you're doing this things like you have to take care of the indentations. So the YAML strictly follows the indentation. So you are seeing that the key value paths are properly indented. So identity provider. Then I'm going to say the name. The name is for just identification. So I'm going to say this is my first IDB, identity provider. My first IDB. My first IDB. Then we are going to say the mapping method. The mapping method indicates how you are creating the users. So here the mapping method I'm going to use something called climb. So if you use the climb method, the username is already created in the same identity provider. You are going to see that it is already climbed information. There are other methods. You can use something called add. So the add method will add that user, so append that information. Or you can use something replace. the replace will replace that existing user or something like that. So mostly we'll use the climb method. So that will be appropriate for our things. So if the username is already climbed, it is going to show that the username is already climbed in that particular identifier. Then, so I'm going to mention the type. The type is here, it should be htpass wd. The type. Then I'm to mention the htpass wd, that file which I have created. I'm going to mention the htpass wd, that variable. So this is located inside that file data. Then I have to mention, I have to take that name, and name I'm going to say this which I have created the secret. So I have to mention that secret name here. Then the identity provider, so I need to mention the secret name which I have created here. I have to mention the secret name, type, and the name. So I'm mentioning those things, and I'm going to create that. I'm going to save this file. So before saving this file, so I'm going to do a verification. So I'm going to use a watch command. So I'm going to watch a pod, OC get pod, in the project called Openshift Authentication. I'm going to watch for this. So here you can watch that 2 pods are running. The reason for watching this pod is that when you replace this resource, or when you modify this resource, so what happens is these 2 pods will be redeployed. So as a token of accepting the new configuration, these 2 pods will be redeployed. So this is what actually the 4th step. The 4th step is just a verification step. Here you are going to verify that what OpenShift pods are redeployed in this particular project as a token of accepting the configuration change. Okay, so initially it was empty. So when I'm modifying that, it has to accept that change, and it has to restart. So we already seen that in the chapter number 6. So how the API server was restarting when you modify something at the cluster level. Similar to that, when you modify here, so this concern pod will be getting redeployed. So I'll come back here, and I'm going to save that file. So I come back here, and I'm going to save this file. So immediately after saving this file, when you see the edited message, you go here and see after some times this will be redeployed. So the 2 pods which is already existing running here will be started. It will be like so if it is not redeploying, that means something error. So it should now, by the time it should have started the redeployment. So if it is not redeployed, so let me just see any errors here. I think it is not replaced. Okay, I'll do one thing. I'll redirect this to a file. We'll just say this content. I'll just instead of edit, I have to use git. I'll just redirect this to a file. Now here I'll remove this metadata information. It's not required, except the name. So here we modify these things again. So identity provider. I'm going to say this is first IDB. And I'm going to say the mapping method. Fine. I'm going to say the name type. Type is going to be HTTPS. Then I have to mention the variable, which is HTTPS WD. Then I'm going to say the file data. You have to mention the name of that secret, which is my secret. I mentioned this information. I save this file. So here I will replace this resource. I will do OC replace, and I will point out to this file. I'm going to replace this resource. Maybe when I do the direct edit, so maybe some mistakes I have done, so that the file is not edited. So I'll just follow this method so that even if it is not edited, I'll see what is the error. So here it will directly replace that resource. Now I will see, I should see the replace now. Now it is replaced. So after once it's replaced, now here I would go and see these two pods are redeployed or not. This two pods should get redeployed. If it is not redeploying, then there is a mistake here. I think the mistake should be identity providers. Let me replace it again. And now you can see this is getting replaced. New pod is created and the old pod is getting terminated. And now you can see that two old pods are terminated and two new pods are running. So now you also can check the resource. If you look at the resource now, the OAuth cluster. Look at the resource now. Now this resource which was empty before, now it has got this the identity provider information. And now we'll see the mechanism. So now we are going to see. So now I'm going to log in from the workstation. So we have created two users, Raj and Sam. Now I'm going to say whether I'm able to log into the cluster as this two user. So this will follow this mechanism. So then it will authenticate that user. So that as a user I'm able to get into the Openshift cluster. So I try to do a login. So let me before doing login. So when you're doing the login for the first time as a user, so here it is not required because I already logged in as the kubeadmin user. But if you are very first time you're logging from a client system, so here I'm going to log in as a user Raj with the password. So with this password which I have given for that user was Ldap. Then I have to mention the API URL. But here if I don't mention the API URL also, it will log in because the API URL is stored as a fingerprint in my system. So if I try to log in now, you can see now the login is successful. So I can log in as user Raj. can see UC format. So I can see that this is a user Raj. So I can log in as other user also. Other user which was Sam. For the Sam I given a different password. It was Ldap123. So here I'll use Ldap123. So now I can see I can log in as user Sam. Now we can see one thing here. So previously I was user Raj and I'm just logging in as user Sam. So what happened to the user Raj who had already logged in? So this user has been logged out. So forcefully that at the terminal level at a time only one user will be active. So if you open any new terminal or if you open a new window, you can see that only that one user will be active. So you can see OC home. Now the user will be Sam. Even if you open a new window, there you can see OC home. You can see the user Sam. So if you log in into the terminal, in any terminal, if you log in into as one user, so that user will be there throughout that terminal. So if you open even multiple terminals, if you open a separate terminal, so that user will be active. So automatically the previous user will be knocked out. So this is like a superficial way of logging into the cluster. So whatever the previous users are there, so as that user will be logged in. And also you have to remember that when you log out, so you will not be changing to the previous user. So as you know, when you are using the SSH or something, in the SSH, if you exit as that user, so what happens is you will be getting a login as the previous user, but here cannot it will not log in as a user. It will just get you out of the cluster. So if I do OC format, now you can see now if I do OC logout, then I'm logged out. So when I do that OC format, you are not going to be a previous user. You will be completely logged off the cluster. You'll see there. Again, you have to log in as any user. So this is how you create the users, configure the identity provider. Using this identity provider, you'll be creating the users. And if you want to configure the other identity providers, so I'll provide the reference to the documentation. Here you can go to the Google and can search for Openshift documentation 4.5. There you can go to the, so once you open the main documentation page, there you're going to find a section called configure. Under that section you're going to have a manual called authentication and authorization. So in the Openshift documentation you have many things. So here you go to the section called configure. There you find a section called configure. Under that section you will find a manual called authentication and authorization. If you open this manual, in this manual, so they will give you information about how to configure the different identity providers. The first will be HTPass, then you will see the Ldap and all these things. So here you can go to the chapter 4, there you find configure identity providers. So here you find how to configure the HTPass identity provider on different things like Linux, Windows, like that, and how to configure the Keystone identity provider and how to configure the Ldap identity provider. See all these things, you will see all these things. So if you look into that, the mechanism almost remains the same. So you will be creating a secret of Ldap information. Then you will configure the OAuth cluster. So when you are configuring this OAuth cluster, so here the identity provider name, the type will be Keystone. So this informations are related to the Keystone information, like the TLS Keystone certificate and the domain name, which are specific to the Keystone server. That information you have to fetch it here. But in the HT pass, I don't require this because that is very simple. I don't know this. I'm not mentioning this information. And you can create that file, and to that file you can configure that resource. Similarly, you can configure the Ldap. The Ldap, you are going to provide the Ldap later. First, you will configure the Ldap according to the Ldap requirement, the Ldap mechanism. Then you will modify this worth cluster. So in the worth cluster, you will provide information. The type will be Ldap. You will provide information which is relevant to that Ldap authentication mechanism. Then you will configure that. Then you will apply that changes to the worth cluster. Then you can able to log in as the Ldap user. So you can follow this documentation. I'll provide this reference. Okay, another reminder, like try to complete this survey. So if you have completed, just let me know that you have done the survey. So this is very important. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. And now we'll see about the next thing is like a user modification. So far you have seen how to configure the user for the first time. So here that we are going to see how to do the user modification. So because we are not going to be just configure one time that identity provider and going to sit there. So there may be some need to add some users, there may be some need to remove some users, there may be some need to modify the user credentials. So these are the user modification which we will be doing so frequently. So how to do this user modification? So does the user modification, I have to repeat the entire steps which I done for the identity provider configuration, or I have to do some other different steps. So we'll see that. So how to do the user modification? Modification in the sense you are going to add a user or delete a user or modify the user credential like that. First thing, when you are doing the user modification, what you will do is you will get that secret which you have configured in this location. You have created this secret over here. You will extract this secret to your local system to get the updated information, so that you have the updated file. Through that file you will be able to find that user details. So you will extract this user from here using this extract command, OC extract secret command. You will be extracting that secret to any location in your local system. So after extracting it, in that file which you have extracted, you will do the modification. So you will add user, or you will remove the user, or you can update the password for the user. You can do the modification. That is the second step. And third step, you will update that information. Once you modify that, so whatever there is in the current file in your local system, that information should be updated to the secret in that Openshift config project. So that information should be updated. So to update that, we'll be using a command called OC set data to update the secret information. Once you update it, you will again see that that auth pod will be redeployed to accept the new change. And once it is redeployed, then do that operation, whatever you've done, the user operation. Whether if you have deleted the user, you will see that you cannot log in as that user anymore. Or if you have added a new user, you can see that you can able to log in. So you will see that changes over here. So now we'll do the user modification. So how to do that? So we don't have much work when compared to the user creation or identity provider configuration. So here I'm going to do the user modification. First thing is first step is you have to extract that secret. Step 1. So extract the secret to the local system. So I'm going to use OC extract. Extract secret. The name of the secret is my secret. So I'm going to extract it to a location. So I'm going to extract it to this directory called documents. So this secret is available inside this project, which is Openshift-config. So I'm going to extract this secret. Now you can see a file called htpasswd is created. So you can look at that file. So this will just have that information. If you look at that htpasswd file, you will see the same information which you have configured, the Raj and the Sam. So this is the file which we have given as input. So we have placed that file in this mypass directory. It's the same file. I'm seeing that information over here. The same file, but I'm extracting to the different location. I'm looking at the file. So this provides me the same, because after that I didn't do any modification. So you will see the exactly same information. So I'm extracting this information here. So after extracting it, I'm going to do the user modification. So I want to add a user. So I want to add say 2 more users here. So to add the user, we use the step 2. So and the user modification can be anything. You can add a user or remove a user. If you want to remove a user, just remove this entry from this, open this in the Vim and remove this entry from the file. That means that the user will be removed. So I'm going to add a user. So htpasswd small b capital B, the encryption method. So the file path which is inside the document, the file name is htpasswd. They are going to add a user called Mark. So I'm going to give him a password redat321. So similarly, I'm going to add another user with the same password. So I'm going to add a user called John. I'm adding a user here. So now if you look at the file, you can see 2 more users are added to the file. So previously only I had 2 users. Now you can see 2 more users are added. So I totally have 4 users. So this is the step number 2. So I do the modification. Step number 3. So I have to update this information. Step 3. So as per this step, which is we are doing here, step 1 I have done. Step 2 is completed. I did the user modification. Step 3, I need to update the information, the set data command. So I need to update this information. I'm going to use the command called oc set data. So oc set data. I'm going to set for the secret. Name of the secret is my secret - from file. The file I have to provide it through a variable. So this variable is constant htpasswd. Here I'm going to say documents in htpasswd, that file name, this path. So I'm just giving this path. I'm storing that as a variable. You have to always store that variable as htpasswd. Then I'm going to update that in the project Openshift-conf. So this is the command to update that secret. So once you update it, so you have to observe the same change. Like you have to see that 2 pods should be redeployed. So I have to use watch command, watch oc get pods. So you have to watch it in the project Openshift-conf. But not config, authentication. So I have to watch for it. It should get redeployed. So as per the flow mechanism, what I am doing is I'm just modifying the information over here. So I'm not touching anything here. So I'm just leaving it because there is no change here. So the name and everything remains as it is. So I'm not touching this file or this configuration. I'm just modifying here. So this is also linked to this pod, to this flow mechanism. Even if you modify here, you will see that this pod will be redeployed because the information is now changed. It has to accept the new information, so it will be redeployed. So that the old pods will be terminated and 2 new pods will be running. So I'm going to update this information. So once I update it, you should see now the data is updated. Here you will go and see. Now it has started creating the container. So it has started the redeployment process. So once the redeployment is done, so I can expect what I've done the configuration. So I can able to log in as that new users to the system. Now 2 pods are running. So now I will try to log in as the user. So which I've created the user Mark and John. As this user I can able to log in. So we'll see login user Mark. So you can see now my login is successful. Also I can log in as the user John. So now you can see that user modification works fine. So this is how you do the user modification. Other modification you will do it in the same way. Okay. So we are done with the 4th chapter, first section, which is about creating the, that is, sorry, not 4th chapter, 3rd chapter, first section, which is about configuring the identity provider. Now I'll move to the second section, which is about applying permission. So how the user, for this user, how you are going to apply permission. So how you are going to give a role-based access control. So how you are going to apply permission, what are the different permissions we have. So we are going to study about that, and we are going to do how to apply that. We are going to see. So I'll go to that project, not project, we'll go and go to the slide. So here, defining applying permission using RBAC. So we have to understand some some terms and terminologies. First, we start with the types of users. So what are the types of users are there at the Openshift container platform? So at the server level, we have different types of users like root user, regular user, you can say system user, like that. And Openshift container platform also we have different users. The first type of users are regular user, so which we have configured just now. So they are the regular users. So for that regular users, we will be assigning roles. Based on the roles, they'll be acting as a acting with a different authority. And these are the regular users. Then there are some system users, also system users, and also there are some system groups. So which is mainly created for system level management or platform level management, like doing the internal platform functions or platform level management. So we will not do anything with that system level things. System level things. Whenever you are seeing the system users, you are not going to modify anything. So these are the some system users. To identify the system user, to start with the system colon like Openshift register something like whatever the starting with system. So that means the system user. It's used for the internal platform management function. And the last user is the service account. Service account is not strictly a user, but it acts in place of user. It acts like a substitute account. We are using that for the privilege account, privilege escalation. So as we are using the service account. Service account is also a type of, it's classified as a type of user in the Openshift documentation. That they have classified the service account is also as a type of user. Because we are protecting the integrity of the regular user through the service account. So it acts in place of the user. So this is also classified as a type of user. So these are the major 3 types of users we have. So now we are going to deal mostly with regular users, and we will see a system group. So there we have to do some modification for the system group. So we'll see that when we are doing that. So already we learned about service account. Service account we have used in the chapter number 4 for doing a privilege escalation. And now we come back to the role-based access control. So here we have the authorization process. The authorization process involves 3 things. So, or managed by 3 things. One is rule, role, and role binding. You need to understand what this 3 terms means. A rule is something which is we are exercising on some object. So in the Openshift, we have different objects. So we learned about these objects like projects, pods, services, replicas, etc. We have different objects we have worked upon so far, and these objects has some some kind of a permission for this object. So we call that as a rule, individual permission on this particular kind of object. For example, if you take project, I can create project, I can delete project, I can edit project, I can assign like labels to the project, I can modify the project. So I can do these steps with respect to the project. So these are some of the individual rules which you have. So we have create rule for creating the project. We should have delete rule for deleting the project. So these are the individual rules which we have. We call these rules, or we call this verbs, which is an action which we are doing on that particular object. And some rules like this rules, create, delete, edit, patch, on this object need read and write permission. First I should able to read what is a project, then only I can delete that project or modify that project, write that project. So I need to have read write permission for this set of rules. So this rules revolves around the read write policy. So this set of rules required read permission on this object, read write permission on this object, and there are other set of rules like view, list, get, watch, and this rules doesn't require write permission. Just it's enough you have the read permission. So on this object, so it will be enough that you have the read permission on this object. You will be able to because we are just going to read the content. You are not going to modify anything. So we can have different set of rules together, but this rules alone will not be any beneficial to me because I'm not going to give only one rule to a user. So I'm not going to say create a project. So he's not just going to keep on create project. Sometime in case he should be in a position to delete the project, and in some cases he should be in a position to modify the project. So then only that will be beneficial for him. So I cannot individually add this users. That will be a tedious job. So for that reason, we move on to the concept called a role and role binding. So role means whatever the rules which you have learned, and these rules will act upon the particular objects. So with the different rules, I form a role. So I can name that role. So any name, for reference, I can name that role. So that when I'm assigning to the user, I'll use that role of that name, and I'll assign that name to that user. And there is something called once you form the role, and we have at the one end we have the user which we have created using the identity product mechanism. So simply having the role is also not beneficial to me. I have to assign this role to the user. So then only the user will have some kind of authority. The role may be the admin role, or the role may be a executive role, or role may be a developer role. The role has to be assigned to the user. Depending on the role and what that role is capable of, the user will be able to work inside the cluster. Within that boundary, he will be able to use work inside. So this process is called process of assigning the role to the user is called role binding. So also you can call this policy binding, since we are modifying the things at the main policy level. Okay. And next thing is classification of roles. So what are the classification and scope of roles? So a major classification of role starts with two classification. One is custom role. The custom role we can create ourselves. So the own role which we are creating by ourselves. We are defining the role limitation. We are defining the role capability. The role which has authority on different objects. We will define everything. We will form that role. That is a custom role. So we are customizing and we are forming the role. So this role will not be there by default. We have to form this role. So that's a custom role. In our curriculum, we are not covering the custom role. So how to write the custom role, how to create the custom role. So we are not specifically covering that. But custom roles you can create it. So custom role, using that you can create a very efficient role through which you can control the user. And there are other role which is default role. So we are going to see this role only, default role. The default role, as the name indicates, is there in the cluster by default, because we are not going to do any special effort to get this role. So this is there by default. So in the cluster, so once you create the cluster, so this role is available, because this role is required, because initially the cluster will not have any role. So if I don't have any role, I have to create the role. So I should know how to create the role. So without that, I cannot go and do that. So for that, just to ease the user, so we have the default roles which we can use and start initially working on that. So whenever we need more customized role, then you can go and create our custom role and use that role to be assigned for the user. Okay. And with respect to the role, a role can have a scope. So there are two scopes. One is the entire cluster scope. So the role can act inside the cluster. The role will have authority across the cluster. Another scope is just inside a project. If the user is having a role, we call that project scope, or you can say local scope. The user is having that scope. His power or authority just will be in that project only. So he cannot exercise his authority outside of that project. So that's what the project scope. So I can say local scope. So each role has its own scope. So one is custom scope, cluster scope, because it will be in the power authority will be toward the cluster, and there is a project scope. It is limited to a particular project. So we have both the scopes in both the roles, like in the default role as well as here we have the scope. And after this, the custom role classification stops here, because we cannot classify this further. Then because it is up to the user who is going to create the role, who is going to customize the role. He will customize it depending on his requirement. So the custom role classification stops here. So we'll have the default role classification, because default role is a fixed role which is already available. So we are going to study about the different roles at the different scope. So at the cluster scope, we have these three roles. This is a default role. We have cluster admin, cluster status, and self provisioner. And at the project scope, we have four different roles: admin, edit role, view role. So then in the bracket you can find typically for whom these roles will be assigned. So edit role will be typically assigned for a developer, and for the project manager, project admin role will be assigned, and the executive role, so one who is just to view the information, for whom the view access will be given. So these are the scopes of the role. I'll take a screenshot because I need for this reference. Now we'll discuss about how these roles are working. So we'll start with the role on the cluster, that is a default cluster role, the role on the cluster side or on the cluster scope. The first role is cluster admin. So the cluster admin has a complete authority. So has a complete authority on everything. So on the cluster. So they can able to modify anything on the cluster. They can add a node. They can create a project, delete a project. They can set the constraints for the project. They can modify the constraints. So they have full permission across the cluster. So how to look into that authority? So what is the role authority is? So what this role is capable of? You can look into that by this command. You can use OC describe cluster role. So the name of the cluster role, I'm going to say cluster-admin. So if you see this, if you describe this role, you can see. So this star mark or asterisk mark indicates that on all the resources. So on all the resources, so we have authority. So there is no specific resource where you will not have authority. On all the verbs like create, delete, edit, patch, view, get, all the verbs can be used. So nothing will be prevented for this cluster admin. So this is the power of the cluster admin. If you want to know what a role is capable of, you can use this command to check. So OC describe cluster role, then the name of the role. It will show you what that role is capable of. Okay. And this is what a cluster role is. Cluster admin. User with this role can have super access to the cluster resource. This user can perform any action on the cluster and have full control of all projects. So this is the cluster role, cluster admin role. So how to assign this role to the user? To assign the role to the user. So first I should be a cluster admin. So here initially when you are into the cluster, you will be a cube admin. I will be logging as a cube admin. Then I can give authority for some user. So for example, I have the user called Raj. So Raj is not having any cluster level things. If I log in as user Raj, so if I log in as user Raj, you can see if I do OC get pods, so you can see you cannot list the pods in that particular namespace. Or when you do OC get nodes, you cannot list the nodes at the cluster level because you don't have authority. And if you try to see the projects in the cluster, what are the projects are there in the cluster? If he tries to see the project, you can see that no, you cannot see the projects which is there in the cluster. Even though he can create project, you can see the message. You can try to create a new project, but he has to create a new project and start working, but he cannot see the project which is already there in the cluster. So this is the limitation. So for the regular user, so if I want to make if I give the role of cluster admin to the user can able to do this function. The user can able to list all these things. So I'll convert back again as cube admin. So I'm going to give the role. So before giving the role, you can just do OC get a cluster role binding. -o wide. So here I'm going to grep for the username Raj. So I will not find anything because he is not having any cluster role. So this is a shortcut to find whether that user is having any role in the cluster or not. Then I'm going to assign the role. So I'm going to do OC ADM policy add cluster role to user. The name of the role which I'm going to add is cluster hyphen admin. Then the name of the user, which is Raj. So now I added the user. Now if you execute the same command above, you will see that the Raj user is now having a cluster admin role at the cluster level. You can see that's good. And if I log in now as the user Raj, you are going to see the different things. Like if I now log in as user Raj, now you can see the same message which you are seeing for the cube admin. So when you log in as a cube admin, you see the same message which you are seeing for the Raj user. Now because now you have given the full permission for the Raj user. So now the Raj user is equivalent to the cube admin. So now you can do anything in the cluster. Now you can list the node in the cluster. You can just use OC get nodes. You can list the nodes in the cluster. You can list the projects in the cluster. So OC projects. You can list all the projects in the cluster. So I can revoke back the same authority to remove that role. For example, I want to remove this role from the user Raj. So again log in as a main cluster admin. So I can do OC EDM policy remove cluster role from user. I'm going to remove the cluster role cluster admin the user Raj. Now you will see a warning. So then you can see that you will see the removed message. Then if I try to get this one, you can see that again I'm not having anything. If I log in as a user Raj, you will see that is returns back to the older state. If you do OC get nodes, you see that you cannot able to list it because the role is removed from you. So this is how that role binding particularly works. Then the next role is cluster status. The cluster status role is like a read-only load at the cluster level. So like I can able to view the information about the cluster, see the information about the cluster, but I cannot modify anything at the cluster level. So this role can be given for some high-level officials, so who is going to see the information, see the cluster level things, see the cluster operations happening over there. So for that kind of persons, you can give this particular role, the cluster status role. But it is just a read-only role. If they try to modify anything, so they can be able to do it. They cannot modify the deployment file. They cannot modify the other files. So they can simply have a cluster level information. They have like they will be an executive user, so who is just going to see the overview of the cluster. So for that, for them this permission will be sufficient, so that they don't accidentally modify anything. So the way you assign this role and remove this role is same as you did it for the Raj user. Next, we'll go to the last user in this category, which is self-provisioner. So if somebody has this role called self-provisioner, that means that user can create their own project inside the Openshift cluster. So the user is able to create and maintain their own project and deploy the application inside the cluster. So when they have the role self-provisioner. And one more thing, this self-provisioner role by defaultly it will be there for a group called system group. For that system group, this role will be by defaultly assigned. And because of this role, what happens is the user can able to create project. The user will have the ability to create project. So for example, if I log in as user Raj, so you can log in as user Raj with the password Ldap. So you can see that I'm able to see the message. You don't have any projects. You can try to create any new project. Not only user Raj, like if I log in the user Sam or John, if I log in as any user, so you can see the same message. So Sam I given 1 2 3. You can see the same message. So because we are seeing this message, so why everybody is having the ability to create a project? Because of the reason that we have a system group and everybody will be the member of that system group. So that's the reason. And the system group has got that role. So that is the main point. So here now this user, I have logged in as a user user John. So I can create a project. I can use OC new project. So I can create a project called test. I can create a project. As you can see, the project is created. I can delete a project. OC delete project test. So I can delete a project. So I can create and delete project. So any user who is logging into the cluster, they are able to create project and delete project. But this is not a consistent behavior. So this is not a desired behavior at the production level, because anybody creating a project and they can create a deploy an application. So that is not a like you can say consistent behavior. So we will not have a trace who is creating a project, who is consuming how much resources. So there will be no consistency in the cluster. But the default cluster design is like that, because cluster is designed. The cluster can be utilized for multiple environment, like production environment, non-production environment, or in the testing environment. So there may be the use case that you have to have just every user can able to independently create the project. But when it comes to the production side, this is inconsistent behavior. So we want to remove this behavior. So we want to see that this behavior, but regular users should not be able to create a project. Only the user with the cluster level permission or cluster admin permission, they can able to create a project. Normal users should not be able to create a project. So I want to achieve this condition. So why this behavior is there when you analyze it? So we have a group called system colon you can say system colon authn colon auth. So we have a group. This is a system group. So the names suggest starting with the system. This is a system group, and this group has got a role. The role is self-provisioner role. So this group is having the role self-provisioner. And who are all the members of this group? So as the name suggests, this authenticated OAuth. That means one who is authenticating the OAuth. So in our case, we have 4 users like Raj, Sam, Mark, and John. These 4 users who have authenticated, so these 4 users will be the members of this group. So what the group suggests that the purpose of the group is that role inheritance. Here the group already got a role called self. We are not assigning this. This is a default thing. Now because of this self-provisioner role is there for this group, and these are the members of this group. Ultimately, these members will inherit this role. Okay, so that means they will be able to create a project. With the self-provisioner role, if I have the self-provisioner role, that means I can create a project. So this is the authority of that role. So if you assign the self-provisioner to some regular user, that regular user can able to create a project. So they will get the ability to create the project. So now this default behavior, there's a group. This group is having this self-provisioner role. Because of that, these users will be able to create a project. So this is an inconsistency. So I want to remove this. So I cannot delete this group. This is a system group. Whatever the system level things are there, I cannot delete the system group. I cannot delete the user also. So because the future users which you are going to create, they will also become the member of this group. So I cannot keep on adding, and whenever I am creating a new user, I cannot come here and remove this user from the group. So that will not be the optimal solution. So the optimal solution is just remove this role, because this role is responsible for provisioning that, and this role is inherited through this group. So just delete this role. Once you delete this role, automatically the members will not have this role. The group will be there, member will be there, but the role will not be there. So because of that, these users will not able to create a project. So you will not see that message anymore. So you can try to create a new project. You will not see that message. So we are going to do that here. So we are going to remove that from the group. So I'll just again log back as a cube admin. So if you describe this group, so OC describe cluster role binding. The name of the role binding is self-provisioner. If you describe this role binding, you can see this role, self-provisioner role, is there for a group called system authenticated OAuth. The members of the group are one who is authenticating into the cluster. So they are the members of this particular group. So now I want to remove this P. So I want to remove this one. So OC ADM policy remove cluster role from group. The name of the role is self-provisioner. This is the name of the role. And name of the group, which is system authenticated OAuth. So this is the name of the group. I am mentioning this name of the group. Once I do that, this role will be removed from that group. And if I execute this command again, you see that now this role is not there for anybody in the cluster. So you will see the error. So because it's not there for anybody, it was there for only one group. So now I have removed that also. So now this role is not there for anybody in the group, anybody in the cluster. Now if you log in, so now if you try to log in as this user, so for example, if I log in as user John, you will see a message which was different from before. So you see the message, you don't have any project, contact your system administrator to request a project. That means he cannot create a project now. If you try to create a project, OC create OC new project. If he tries to create a new project, for example like test, if you try to create it, you can see this is throwing an error. So previously it was not throwing an error. So previously the message was also different. Like you can see when I was trying to logged in as user John, you can see a message was, you can try to create a new project by running this command. And I was able to create a project. I can create a project called test, and I also can delete a project called test. So I was able to do that with respect to the project, but now I'm not able to. Not only this user, any regular user. So if I log in as user John or Mark or Sam, they can see login is successful, but they cannot do anything. So they can log in and they can wait. So somebody at the system level, or the system administrator or the cluster administrator, has to assign a project to him. Then only they can work in the cluster. Otherwise they have to simply log in and they have to wait for somebody to assign a project. So now this is the consistency. So in the cluster, now the regular users, they will come only if they have the project, they can work in that. If they don't have the project, there will be no use for them. So just they have to log in and have to wait for somebody to assign a project. They cannot do anything in the cluster. So that brings the consistency. And now who can create the project? The cluster administrator. So only the person who is having the cluster admin role, so they can create the project, or cube admin create the project. So after creating the project, they will be assigning the project to the user. So then only the user will have that project to work on. Okay, so this is the last role, which is the self-provisioner. So now we have covered the role on this scope, the cluster scope, which is cluster admin, cluster status, and self-provisioner. Now we'll jump on to this one. So project scope roles. So we have 4 different roles. One is admin role, the edit role, view role, and basic user role. We will understand the scope of these roles. So we have cluster default project roles. The first role is the admin role. So when you assign some admin role to some user, that user can manage that project. So administrator that do administration job or that project. So they can able to create application. They can able to give access to other user to the project. They can read the constraint information in the project. So they can do that in things. So this is the role, admin role. The user in this role can manage all project users, including granting access to other users to access the project. So this is the admin role. So you can assign this role depending on that, because now the user is not having any role. And for example, I can assign a role. For example, I can create a project. I can log in as the cluster administrator, as a cube admin. So I will log in as cluster administrator. Then I will create a project, OC new project. So I can create a project called project test project 1 or project test project 1. So I'm creating a project. So I create another project, test project 2. So I can assign a user to this project. I can assign the regular user. I can assign this project to them. So for example, now the SAM user is not having any project. When he logs in, he sees this message. For the SAM user, I can make this SAM user as an admin for this project, the test project 1. So how to do that? You can just use OC policy. So here I'm not using the term ADM, because ADM is only at the cluster level. And also I'm going to say OC policy add role. Simply add role. I'm not mentioning add cluster role. If it is a cluster level scope, you have to say add cluster role. Just I'm saying here add role to user. The name of the role, I'm going to say admin role. The name of the user is Sam. Then the name of the project, I'm going to say the project name is test project 1. So if you don't mention the project name, this role will get assigned to the current project. My current project may be different. So always make sure for which project you are assigning that role. So I'm assigning this role. Now this role is assigned to that user in that particular project. If you see that, if you do OC get role binding to verify that role binding -oy, so name of the project, which is test project 1, we can verify that. Now you can see now the user Sam is having authority, that he is in cluster admin. So the first cluster admin is the cube admin. Apart from that, the user Sam is having admin rights over this project. Well, in this project, they have the user Sam will be able to exercise authority. Now if you log in as the user Sam, you will see this project for him. If you log in as user Sam, now you can see you have one project on this server. So that project is test project 1. Only he has this project. So he cannot even list other projects. If I do OC get projects, he cannot even list other projects available. So he will not be aware of other projects. Once he logs in, he can just see what the projects he is having. So when he try to see the other projects information, they can see only the project which is accessible to him. So other project information he cannot see. So even though we have 75 plus projects in the cluster, so you can see only the projects which is available for that particular user. So now he is admin user. So as admin user, he can like create application. So he can do like OC new app. So hyphen name. So we can create any application to inside this. Docker registry. QA.io / So I'm creating an application. So I can create application. I can scale the application. OC scale hyphen replicas. So I can scale an application to like 3 times the deployment. So I can do all these things. So I can create application and all manage these things. And additionally, I can also grant access to other users to access this project. I can give a role. I can do the role binding for other users only in this project. I can do that. For example, as a user Sam itself, I can do a role binding for him. So as a user Sam, so here if you look at the username, OC who am I? So as a user Sam, I can grant a role to other user. For example, I can grant a role to the user called John. So OC policy, add role to user. So I'm going to add a role for the user John. I'm going to add a role called view role to the user John. So in this project, the project name is just current project. I just current project test project 1. So I can add a role. Now I can view the role. You can see. So the Sam is having the view, but who did the role binding? Sam did the role binding. So previously it was not Sam, it was the cube admin. But for this project alone, because Sam is the cluster admin for this project, he can grant access to the user. So that's why the John user is having the view access to this project. So this is what that means, granting access to other users to access the project. And next role is edit role. The main difference between the edit role and admin role is admin role is in the edit role we can able to do the same thing as we do in the admin role. We can able to create application, we can able to patch that information, create that resource and all these things. Only restriction is that in the edit role, user cannot give access to other user to this project. The admin user can give access, but the edit user, typically we will give it for the developers. One who is having the edit role, they cannot give access. That means they cannot do the role binding. So for the project, so they can just simply work inside the project. They can modify the resources inside the project. They can create application inside the project and all these things. They can patch that application. All these things they can do, but they cannot give access to the project unless the admin role user. So that's the difference between the edit role and admin role. And next role is the view role. So view role, they can just view the project resource but cannot modify the project resource. So for example, I have given the view role for the user John. So if I log in as user John, so with the password Ldap 321, as I log in as this user, you see that he is having a project here. Project, he can able to see the application. You can use OC get pods and see the pods in this application. But if he tries to scale this application, so if he tries to scale this to this is a patching operation actually. So I'm going to patch some information. If he tries to patch that application, he is scaling the application to 5 times. So when he tries to scale it, this will not be working for him because he is not having that other. He can just view. He can use describe command. He can use get command. All these things he can do, but he cannot do anything. He cannot tamper that project. He cannot edit that file, any file inside that project. So only that is having an executive role to view that application. And the last role is that the basic user role. So this is rarely used. This role, you cannot do anything with this role. Even you cannot view the resources inside the role. If I have this role, that means just giving a basic access to a project. That means I have a project, so that's all. So I'm inside some project, but I cannot do anything on that project. Later on, somebody has to change a role to change my role so that I can able to work inside the project. This is the basic user access. Basic access I'm giving to a. That means they can read the project information. So they have the project allocated to them. Later on, we have to change the role. So that is it. But there will be no use case for that. Like the use case may be that we want to assign a role, we want to give a project to the user, but he should not do anything in the project, but he should have a project. In that case, you can just go and use this role, which is very rarely used. This is other role which is available at the this scope of the project scope. So these are some of the roles which we are having. And lastly, we'll discuss about how to create groups. So when you're doing a role binding, so you will see the option to do the role binding using a group or using a user. So we have used the different users to assign the group role binding. So there may be a scenario where I have to create a group, and for that group I have to assign a role. I have to do some kind of a group-based role binding. In that case, first we need to know how to create the group. So now let me log in as again the kubeadmin. So how to create the group? So when you see when you're doing any policy binding, when you're doing like OC policy, like add role, when you press the tab, you'll see the option. So I have two options. Either I can add it to the user, or I can add it to the group. So we know how to add to the user. So that's what we are seeing through. Now we'll see. If you know how to create the group, then just mention the group name instead of mentioning the username. That's a change which you are going to do. Okay. So here I'm going to just see how to create a group. OC ADM groups, and I'm going to say the name of the group new. So I'm going to call this group as my admin. So the group is now created. So it will not have any members initially. So OC get groups. It's not going to have any members. So I need to add a member to the group. So OC ADM groups, add users. So then I have to mention the name of the group, which is my admin, and the name of the user, like Sam. Can add. So, but at a time you can add only one user using the command. You can add like this. So when you see the get groups, you can see now the users Sam and Raj are added to the group. If you want, you can remove it, remove the group. So if you want to remove the user from the group, I don't want to remove the group. I just want to remove the user from the group. You can use OC ADM groups, remove user, so then name of the group, which is my admin. So mention the name. So if you want to remove the Sam, so Sam will be removed from the group. Now if you look at the group, you can see only the Raj user is there. So if you want to delete the group, just do OC delete group, then the name of the group. So this will delete the. So if I do that, OC delete group, it will delete all the group. It's not going to delete the user, just the group. So I don't have any group anymore. So this is how you create the group. So with that, we come to the end of the discussion on this chapter, in this section. So we have seen about role-based, what is cluster role, what is a local role. We have seen how to use how to assign the role-based access control on command line. then we have seen about different roles. So default roles, which are like admin role, cluster admin role, basic user. So here in the table they have given the mixed format. So you can understand the role in this way, like the role and the different scopes. The project scope we have different role. The cluster scope we have 3 different roles. In the table they have given us a single, like in a single alphabetic order they have given the role. And we have seen how to add the role, so using the OC policy command. And we have seen about types of users, so the regular users, system users, service accounts. So with that we complete this section, and also we complete this chapter. So we complete now chapter number 3. So we have completed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now we'll move on to the 8th chapter. We'll take a 10 minutes of break also, like we are continuously taking here. We'll take 10 minutes of break and then we'll continue this session. Meanwhile, who have not completed the survey, please complete it. Okay, Mohan, Harish, Manoj, thanks for completing the survey. So who are not done so far, please complete the survey. It's going to end within a few minutes. Okay, so Ponmani, Jayanti, thank you. Start back by 5:35. We'll start the next session.
Hello.
So we'll try to finish within 1 hour, like by 6:30 we'll try to finish it. We'll start back by 5:35 p.m. We'll take just a 10 minutes of break, then we'll start.